welcome back to Resourceful Humans. My name is Corey Haber and I'm your host. And today I have with me Dr. Folks and Ben, and they are experts in the LGBTQ plus area, work with lots of businesses, lots of business executives in education and training. So I'm so glad to have them. They're going to give us a little education today too. So why don't you two introduce yourselves and then we'll jump right into things.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Ben Green. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am an openly transgender man, and we'll talk a little bit later about what that actually means. And I just graduated recently from Brandeis University, and I run my own business as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and a public speaker about my experiences as a transgender man. So I help companies and executives learn to be more supportive to transgender and LGBTQ people at their companies and how to support all the people in the broader communities around them as well.
Hey, my name is Dr. Ashley Folks, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist, and I run a consulting firm, LGBTQ sensitivity and transgender inclusion. And we work with companies around the US and around the world in terms of creating safe spaces for their LGBTQ plus employees. I am also an openly trans male, and we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about what that experience is like in the workplace. Super excited to be here. I think it's going to be a great conversation.
I think so. I'm so excited to have the both of you. And really quick, I'd like for you both to tell us what part of the country you're in too.
Sure. I am in sunny St. Louis, Missouri.
Hey.
And I am in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Ooh. So we have also very diverse as far as location too, which I think is going to be helpful to hear. So let's start off, explain to, or me or us, what does transgender mean to you? Ben, you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so to me, what its general definition is someone who identifies in a way that is not the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. So whatever is written on my birth certificate is not really how I feel as a person. So I was born and raised a girl, and that didn't really sit right for me. It was something that when I looked in the mirror, I just kind of didn't really recognize who was looking back, and that was my experience. And so I cut my hair and I changed my name and changed a lot about me and identify as a male now, and I'm much happier that way. So that's kind of my personal, the way that, what it means to me.
Yeah, so I agree. I think what's really important is that when we're talking about what it is to be transgender is that we discuss the fact that there's a continuum, right? That oftentimes what we see in mass media is someone who has gone through the transition process in ways that are obvious to the observer, right? But that's not the case for every trans person. And so you have a lot of folks that fall underneath this umbrella of transgender that maybe have not transitioned. And I think that that's probably a part of the conversation that we'll have as we move forward. But yeah, I echo that it is essentially, when we're thinking about the sex that you're assigned at birth and the gender roles associated with that someone who's transgender doesn't necessarily align with the sex that they were assigned at birth and the corresponding expectations as it relates to their gender. And so that's a super broad umbrella, which I think is a beautiful thing, because that means that there's lots of people that could be swept up in that definition. It's meant to be inclusive and not exclusive. And so, yeah, that's kind of what it means to me.
I think that connects to such an interesting point for me, talking about how there's such a broad umbrella. And one of the things people talk about is they say there are so many different identities, there are so many letters in the acronym, there are so many different names people have, and they're overwhelmed. I think the last time I checked, there were 64 different gender identities that were commonly known. And a lot of people ask me, why is there a need to be so many? You all fit under this umbrella. And I think one of the biggest things, and it's why we like to all be under the trans umbrella and under these smaller umbrellas, because it lets you know that there are other people who have felt the same way you felt. No matter how differently you experience or show it, there are people you can kind of come together and feel that sense of community with. So even if you only know 2 or 3 people who identify the same as you, it's the fact that you have a name for it and have a community for it. And then there's a broader community, but it's nice to find these smaller communities of people who really feel the same way you do, even if they experience it differently.
And I get that question a lot too, like, so why does it matter? And I think sense of belonging is really, really important. And so like if you're that person who is, transgender in the strictest sense of the word, and by that I mean the way that most people view transgender to be, then you have that label and people know that that's what that means. But there are so many different ways that a person can identify and feel and know themselves to be and show up in the world, that it's really important to know that you're not the only one. And in some ways, I think it's like super beautiful. Like, I know for me, when I actually got the language to call myself transgender, it was like beautiful. It was beautiful. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's a thing. Like there's other people like me. There's a word for that, And I think that that's the case for people, that might not necessarily identify 100% with transgender as an identification or as a label, but say, yeah, but maybe I am gender nonconforming, or I'm gender fluid, or I'm agender. I mean, there's so many different options that you can literally say, this really is my truth. And guess what? There's other people that have that same truth. And like, that's like super exciting. I like to tell people, especially in business, not to, don't allow the fact that it can be daunting to be a deterrent in terms of you putting forth the effort to understand. Like it can be a little daunting. Like there are lots and lots of genders. There are lots and lots of orientations and lots of ways that people show up in the world, but don't allow that to be a deterrent. Look at that as an opportunity to grow and to elevate, to do research, to study. Don't let that be the thing that causes you not to move forward and advancing your understanding. I personally think that if anything, it's an invitation to deep dive and to a topic that is so nuanced. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I'd really like to hear also, and so would our audience, if you could describe the difference between medically transitioning and socially transitioning, and if you have maybe a story you can share, that would be really helpful, I think, to paint pictures as well.
Sure. So I know for me, socially, to start off with a basic explanation, socially transitioning is all the things that don't have to be done by or with a doctor. So changing your clothes, your hair, these are like your gender expression is the umbrella term for this. So your hair, your clothes, going by a different name or different pronouns, coming out to people. There are a lot of different things that can factor into a social transition. You can, choose to do it in whichever way you'd like. And then a medical transition is having something like top surgery or going on hormones. So I know for me, top surgery was like the pinnacle. That was the thing I was most excited about. And it took me years to get there. And I finally got it. And I am so happy because that was what I really needed. And in the media, there are, I think, 5 trans characters, and they've all had, if you were to watch that and try to make that into the definition, it would say that it's very linear. It is steps along a staircase and you're not happy until you get to the top. So I was like, okay, I have to get surgery now. I have to immediately start hormones. And I was like putting all this work in to try to get to start hormones right away, but it wasn't something I actually wanted. It was just something that like my 5 role models all had done. So of course I had to do it because I didn't know there was another way to do it. So I haven't done hormone replacement therapy yet, and maybe I will, maybe I won't. I'm still deciding, and that's fine because it's not a staircase. It's like Dr. Folk said, it's a continuum, and you just kind of go to wherever on that continuum you'll feel happy and, not try to force yourself to do things because that's the steps.
Yeah. And so I think one of the reasons that people have a tendency to consider medical transition, well, there's a couple of reasons. One of them is that oftentimes is what we see and what we understand in the media, but that also comes because of when we're thinking about how someone actually goes through the process of getting the medical treatment. Oftentimes you need a diagnosis, right? And the diagnosis, and sorry, I'm a clinical psychologist, so we got to go down this just a little bit. The diagnosis becomes necessary for you to get the procedure, right? Well, the diagnosis as a part of the diagnosis for a really long time, you had to have significant amounts of gender dysphoria that caused you significant amounts of distress. And so what people are used to hearing when they meet someone who is transgender is that they experience gender dysphoria and they need to have these changes to their body in order to literally be okay. Now, the definition has changed a little over time, right? And thank goodness it's gotten a little more nuanced, but it's still the expectation that you're experiencing gender dysphoria. So the reason I bring that up is because not all trans people experience gender dysphoria. And so if you don't experience gender dysphoria, you might actually not have any desire to transition medically. Like you might not feel like you need to change your body. And so there are a group of, I personally think a pretty significant group of trans folks who don't necessarily experience gender dysphoria in the classic sense, and so aren't actually going through medical transition. Now, they might go through social transition, but not see the need for medical transition, right? They might go through legal transition, right? Which is another type of transition. That's when we're looking at like our legal documents and our papers and making sure that our identification aligns and all of those things happen. They might go through legal transition or social transition, but not actually go through medical transition. Or someone might go through all three, or someone might just go through legal transition. So it can show up in any number of ways is what I'm basically trying to say. And so for me, sharing a little bit about my story, I'm transgender, but I'm not someone that experiences gender dysphoria. So for me, I've never felt the need to transition medically, but I'm no less transgender than someone who does transition medically. I just don't have that specific desire or that specific need. And not that everyone that transitions medically has gender dysphoria. There can be other reasons that you do it. But one of the main reasons that people transition medically is that.
I don't want to interrupt, but I kind of do, because I want to bring this up. These are two examples of things that I have seen. I work with a lot of businesses and meet with a lot of employees. So number one, I have experienced situations where an employee is in that social transition and they're still not decided if they want to do medical transition or not. But they almost feel as if they have to alert or let their employer know if they're going to do that medical transition, because I feel like there's a lot of employers, unfortunately, that feel as though they do not change the pronouns that they use for that person unless they're medically transitioned. And so if you could shed some light on that, I think that would be very helpful. Number one, what do you think about the employee feeling as if they're obligated to let their employer know if they're doing that medical transition or if they're just socially transitioning? And then does that really affect when the employer changes the pronouns that they use for that employee?
I have so many thoughts about that. Did you want to hop on that one, Ben? Or
Please.
Sure, I'll share one quick thing and then I'll let you fire away, Dr. Folks. I think the two big things that sparks for me, number one is when you're talking about having trans employees, you should figure out what your goal is, because what that kind of seems to me like the gold standard for people is having an employee where all of the trans employees feel comfortable coming out. And a lot of people will there's something called being stealth, which is basically where you don't let people know that you're transgender. So sometimes I go places and I don't quite feel safe, so I don't let them know that I'm transgender, and I let them assume that I was assigned male at birth. And so that is a completely valid way to live. And there are some people who live like that at their workplace with, not really with their partner, but with certain members of their family. And, they just they don't want to come out, and that's completely fine. So make sure that you're not trying to say, okay, we really need this person to come out. We really need to make sure that everybody has come out. People are allowed to not come out, and that's completely valid. And I think the other thing is, there's this sense that medical transitioning is like a threshold of committing to it. And that's why people aren't like, well, I'm not going to put in the work to change your pronouns if you haven't crossed the point of no return and had a surgery yet, right? It's kind of this idea that like, you need to commit before I'm going to commit to doing the work for you. I need to know that you have decided this is permanent. And that's such an unhealthy mindset, because gender is a very fluid thing and people's gender can change, and that doesn't make it less valid. And B, because someone shouldn't have to get surgery for you to respect them and refer to them correctly.
Yeah. Well, and so you just hit on something really important, right? that gender is a very fluid thing. And I think a lot of times people feel like you've been disingenuous when you have a shift in gender. And it doesn't mean that someone's been disingenuous or they've been lying or they've not been honest with you. It just literally means that gender is fluid, and that as we're going through our life, like everybody's just trying to figure out how to be the best human being they can possibly be. And there are things about us that change and grow and evolve with time, and gender can be one of those things. And so it's so important to your question of basically, when do I start using the pronouns, right? At what point in this journey do I begin to utilize the pronouns? As soon as someone says to you that those are their pronouns, that's when you start using those pronouns, right? Like that is the threshold. Like that is the line in the sand. When someone says, hey, my pronouns are he, him, his, my pronouns are she, her, hers, that's when you start using those pronouns. And that is, now get this, I've got to go there, you guys. That is, even if there is nothing about their gender expression that aligns with that pronoun. So let's take a step further, even back. Like, we're not just talking about they haven't had surgery yet, but I'm still going to honor it. You know, they still show up. They still have socially transitioned, but so I'll honor it. No. I might show up in a tutu and a tube top and say my pronouns are he, him, his, and if that's what I say, then you honor those pronouns, right? It's about just dignity and respect and allowing people to identify in a way that's comfortable with them, in a way that resonates with them. And so right away, as soon as you know, you know. Now here's the thing. The fact that someone shows up today and says my pronouns are he, him, his does not mean that next year their pronouns can't be different, right? Their pronouns can be different next year. And that doesn't mean that they were like, that they pulled a fast one on you. It doesn't mean that they're confused. It doesn't mean any of those things. It simply means that, you know, you're watching the evolution of an individual, and that can show up in any number of ways. And so, like, when I think about my own journey, you know, I didn't start off identifying with, you know, he, him, and his. You know, at first I was okay with she and her and hers. And then people would use he, him, and his, and that would feel kind of good to me. Like, man, that actually feels a lot better. But I wasn't bothered by her and hers, right? So it was like, I'll respond to either one. And then it was like, oh, you know, actually, the longer time went on, the more uncomfortable I got with her and hers. And it was like, I literally was like, that's kind of uncomfortable. And then we got to a point where it was like, ooh, that actually hurts a little bit. I don't know that I can handle her and hers. Like, that's actually painful. And I ended up transitioning fully to he and him and his. And so, but that was a process, you know, that was the evolution of Dr. Folks, right? It was a process. And who knows, you know, a year from now, I might say they, and that's fine too. But right now, it's he, him, his, and that's what resonates.
And Dr. Folks and Ben, the reason I brought that up is it frustrates me when I see those situations where they feel like that medical transition has to be done for them to refer to that employee with different pronouns. And the only way I can really resonate is and to put it into a different perspective, it's almost just as, you know, for lack of a better word, ridiculous. Like if I were to say to an employer, I have epilepsy, and for them to say, well, I can't confirm that unless you have a seizure in front of me, you know, and that's how I, you know, relate to it. And I know we discussed that before, but it is very similar to that situation. I've grown up with epilepsy. You will probably never see me have a seizure, but to say that I don't have it because you haven't seen it is essentially the same thing to me as saying that someone cannot identify as a he or she unless you see that they are a he or she, which is just, it's absurd, and it happens way too much. And I really think that's why I really wanted to have you two on today, because it shouldn't happen.
I think it's also really an issue of access, right? It's not like I can go to a hospital and say, I'd like top surgery. There is maybe one good top surgeon per state. A couple states maybe have two. It was hard. I got my top surgery. I called for a consultation. They said, great, we can see you in a year and a half. So it's expensive. It is not cheap to get that, because so many insurance companies see it as a cosmetic procedure, especially if you don't have that diagnosis.
Correct.
And then hormones are equally difficult to access. So it's saying that unless you have the time, the money, the resources to get that surgery, even if it's someone, so obviously there are people who don't want surgery. Then there are people who want surgery and just can't get it. You know, where you have to pick where you draw the line. If the medical surgery is going to be your criteria, are you including people who want surgery but can't access it? Like it just doesn't add up. So you need to make sure that, you know, that's another layer of exclusion that you're having there of saying, if you can't afford surgery, you're not trans.
And that's a lot of medical procedures. For example, I mean, a lot of times you do need a doctor's note or a psychologist or psychiatrist note saying that you do medically need that surgery. But even for people that want like a breast reduction, it is not covered. It's considered cosmetic, even if it's causing medical issues. So it's unfair, I think, to hold someone to that medical transition because it's not always financially doable either.
Well, and then on top of that, and so while we're discussing kind of insurance and coverage, I just want to note that there are policies that don't cover, you know, transition at all, right? And
You're
so
absolutely right.
when employers are, you know, in there and they're making decisions around policies, you know, there are plenty of companies that actually exclude many of the things that a person would need if they were going to transition. And so you literally, even if you're gainfully employed and have insurance and have means, you still might not have access because it's not covered.
And really, to be honest, when I've seen that happen where it's excluded and a company still chooses that coverage, it's the end of the day, it was because of the cost. And I preach this all the time. Cheaper is not always better. It's not.
Yes.
With any benefit you offer, which is unfortunately what happens all too much. The cheapest option is the option that's chosen. But yeah, not to get you off topic. So, you know, let's continue on with the transition.
Yeah.
So you mentioned to me that not all people transition.
Yes, 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 yes. Yes, yes, and yes. Not all people transition. So it's really important to understand, and this is kind of similar to what Ben was just saying about medically transitioning. It's the same way when we're talking about any type of transition, whether it's legal, social, or medical, that not all people transition. Some people don't desire to transition, but then there are also a lot of obstacles that get in the way of transitioning. Finance is a really big barrier in ways that people don't even recognize, not just to medical transition, but it can be a big barrier in terms of social transition, and it can be a really big barrier in terms of legal transition. Every document that you want to have changed, there's a fee associated with that. There's a process, right? You have to have access and means to do that. And so not everyone transitions, not everyone desires to transition. There's a lot of people that want to transition that can't afford to transition, or don't have access, or don't know how to transition, don't have the appropriate supports to transition. But they're not any less transgender than someone who has access and means and is able to do all of the things that they'd like to do. It's interesting when we think about and when we talk about and when we think about privilege, a lot of times when we're thinking about marginalized groups, we kind of feel like you can't be a marginalized group and have privilege at the same time. You absolutely can be marginalized and have privilege at the same time. And so, you know, it is a privilege to be able to medically transition, to be able to socially transition, to be able to legally transition. It's a privilege that a lot of people don't have, but they're not any less transgender than those that have that privilege.
Yeah, that's such a crucial thing to acknowledge. And like, so something I have to be aware of myself is that I'm trans, and for a lot of people being trans is a safety concern. And for me, I live in Missouri. When I leave the city of St. Louis, I feel very concerned about my safety, and I don't let people know I'm transgender. That in itself is a privilege, that I am able to be stealth and to make it so that people don't know I'm transgender for my safety. And then another thing that I am just always reminding myself is that my white skin protects my trans body. So I am significantly safer because I am white and I look young, and nobody looks at me and thinks that I'm threatening or has any assumptions about me. And that is an extreme. I am so privileged in some ways, and in some other ways, I'm a member of a marginalized community, and there are so many different layers. There is no escaping intersectionality. Everybody has different ways, and I encourage you to look up the power flower. If you are trying to figure out where you fall, that's such a great way to look at areas you have privilege, areas you don't, to kind of explore your own identity.
Yeah, no, and I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like when I think about even within the workplace, like if we bring this back to something that's really specific to human resources, when I was, in the beginning of my career, when I was working my way up the ladder, I had lots of concerns about coming out, about people knowing, who I was and who I truly knew myself to be. And then the higher I went up the ladder, having gone up and made it to the C-suite and all of that, I had less concern because of the position that I was in. There was a lot of protection in that position. And I was actually in a place where I could try to create space for other people that, looked like me to come in and to have safety and to have a place to blossom. But so I say that to say there's a lot of people that, depending on where you are in your career, you can have legitimate concerns about, hey, especially if you feel like you're disposable, I don't know that I want to say anything that's going to rock the boat. I don't know that I want to do anything that's going to rock the boat when they can just go get another entry level person, right? And so I have to be really careful about how I show up in this particular area in my life. And so that again, like I recognize even my privilege as someone who is, at the executive level, that I'm able to walk into the room and it's, hey, everybody, this is Dr. Folks, he, him, his, and, I'm walked down the hallway and it's yes, sir, and da-da-da. And people, it's just an automatic. Whereas that wouldn't necessarily be the case if I were, entry level. And so there's privilege even in that. And I think it's important that we create space, that we create safety, and that we recognize those things and be intentional in creating safe spaces even for our entry level employees. Like I was sharing with Ben that I just recently had a conversation with someone and they were saying, there was a trans woman and she was saying, that the reason that she wasn't out, and there's lots of reasons not to be out. I guess we can talk about that too if we have time. But the reason that she wasn't out was because she was, very junior in her firm and was concerned about, the possible repercussions and if it would get in the way of her being able to move up the ladder. And I think it's a sad truth, but it's a truth nonetheless.
It is. It's the truth, unfortunately. So how do you suggest to an employee that they handle a situation like that?
Well, and so this comes back to, and this is really, I think, important when we're thinking about coming out. Sometimes there's a really significant difference in terms of the end goal when we're talking about coming out, whether you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. The end game can be a little different. And Ben kind of touched on this earlier. Like for some people, they have the ability to be stealth. And for a lot of people, that's actually the goal, right? Or if we were to put it in racial terms and how it used to be phrased, there are people that have the ability to pass. And for a lot of people, that's the goal. And so coming out might not be the goal. The last thing that they might want is for you to know that they're transgender. Actually, I try to explain to people all the time that, for a lot of trans folks in the utopia in their mind, they would just be walking down the street and you would not even notice them, right? It's just another man walking down the street. It's just another woman walking down the street. Nothing to see here, folks, And so coming out isn't like this thing where they're like, I'm dying to come out. No. Actually, I just want to exist and for you to just see me as I know myself to be. But if you are someone that wants to come out, right? If you are, number one, know that there's no pressure. You don't have to come out. There are those of us that decide to come out for various reasons, right? Maybe we feel inclined to do that. Maybe we feel like it's necessary in terms of our own kind of compass and what we think is right. Maybe you're like me and Ben and you're a consultant and coming out is a part of your daily process, come out every day. But that's not the case for everyone and you don't have to come out. But if you choose to come out, understand that there's things that you need to really, really bear in mind, like safety and security and repercussion and those things. And so I think, like, I wonder, like, what can employers do to make it safer? One of the things that they can do is they can bring in consultants, you know, to create a safe space. Like, that's part of the work that I say Ben and I, like, we do it together, which we don't. We have two different companies, but but it's kind of the work that we do is going into companies and creating safe places for people to show up and be their authentic self, and it'd be safe to do that.
Yeah, I think this is such a key thing for me, that the question, it really can't be what can that employee do? There's so much of a desire when someone comes out to be like, great, we've got a trainer now. And really it's like someone who's trying to do their accounting work or like just do their job and live their life. And like, especially someone who has just come out, or if it's someone who's just beginning their transition, they're not prepared to be doing all of this education and training your whole company and bearing the emotional and mental weight of that. So it really is on the companies to say, okay, we are going to learn, we are going to find someone who does this professionally and not ask this person to be the source of education. And this is companies and in your life. If someone comes out, make sure that you are finding other ways to learn. Ask that person if they want to help educate you, but don't depend on them for it, and make sure you don't force that on them.
When it comes to companies, the onus is on you to provide education to your employees, and the responsibility is not your employees. Absolutely.
And I also just want to say, I kind of feel like waiting to have someone like either one of you come in for a training or education, it's almost like waiting for I just can't think of a better example, but it's almost like waiting for an employee to die before you decide if you want to offer life insurance. You know, I almost feel like it's something that should be done, whether they are aware that they have an employee that's coming out or has come out. It doesn't really matter. If you don't have one, if you don't have any employees that have come out, that doesn't mean that you don't have an employee going through a transition. They may not have announced it. I really feel like employers, especially HR professionals, should consider having someone like yourself come in to educate or assist or train, whether they are aware that there's someone in their employee group that is in that situation. Because it is to me very much the same. Like, we're not going to offer life insurance, and all of a sudden, you know, God forbid someone dies and they're going to offer life insurance, or we're not going to offer, you know, paid lunches 3 times a week unless someone tells us they can't afford food and they're going to starve to death. You know, you shouldn't wait for something to happen to look into it and educate yourself and learn whether it's going to be beneficial to your company. And that's really what I want to get across from this episode is it happens all too often that employers wait until it becomes something that they need to learn about, when they should in fact be proactive and learn about it before they ever need to, or they may not ever have an employee in that situation, but it doesn't matter. They still need to be well educated.
Yeah, well, when you think about your ability to attract the best and the brightest too, you know, trans people, and not just trans people, but LGBTQ plus people. I mean, we pay attention to what companies are safe for us, you know. There are different indexes out there that we're able to look at and say, hey, this is a place where I can show up and be my authentic self. So it impacts whether you have an employee there or not. It impacts who will be drawn to your organization and your ability to draw the best and the brightest. You know, for me, there have been organizations that have expressed interest in me coming on board, but that when I've looked at that organization, I've been like, yeah, no, like if I can't show up and be 100% who I am and feel like that's going to be safe, like I don't want to be there, and I would, you know, respectfully decline. And so that's another thing to look at, right? Your ability to attract the best and the brightest, to keep those that are there, that are a huge asset to your team. So don't wait, like you said, don't wait until you need it to go and get it.
Right.
I think to put another lens on this, right? I am trans, and that's one perspective that I'm bringing. I'm also a Gen Zer. I'm, you know, just graduated from college. So a lot of my peers, even ones who are not trans or members of the broader LGBTQ community, they're people who still care about socially responsible companies, so many young people are graduating and they are looking for companies that care and are educated and have made statements. So if you're looking to hire people who are fresh out of college and they see that your company isn't educated or isn't a safe place for trans people, even if it's not someone who's trans or not someone who knows anyone who's trans, if they see, if this is a safe place for, not a safe place for trans people, how can I really know it's going to be safe for me? Where is the line between making someone safe and someone not? They're not going to want to pick that company. So it's really such a broad pool of talent that you cut off by, not making sure that you're educated and prepared to be a safe place for everyone.
That is a very good point, and I'm so glad you said that. That's true. I really want to touch on pronouns just a little bit. So, and I do feel like employers now in our society have gotten in this habit in the past decades of you look at someone and you predetermine what their pronoun is before you even speak to them, which, and that, I think that for just so long, that's how it's been. And that's not how, we just can't function that way anymore. So I want to hear your suggestions. If an employer were to ask you, how do we move away from that habit? Because it's going to involve the whole team, the whole company, learning how to train themselves out of that habit of determining what you think someone's pronouns are by looking at them. What would your suggestion be? What are things that they can do? How do you approach that? And then why would we not say preferred pronouns?
Okay, yeah, so.
Two questions kind of.
Or two different questions there. So yeah. I would actually like to jump on, I know you and I discussed this before, preferred pronouns. Let me jump on that question. And I have met so many people, well-intended, amazing, beautiful people, who say preferred pronouns, who say, what are your preferred pronouns? Part of that is because there was a pretty big push for people to use that language to be more inclusive. But the problem with literally saying the word preferred pronoun is you're essentially saying that a person's pronouns are a matter of preference. And when it comes to pronouns are very rarely a matter of preference. And so like the way that I like to explain it to people is like, when we say preferred, we're saying that the other option is still a viable option. It's just not our preferred option. Like I prefer white rice over brown rice. Like I'll still eat brown rice, but I prefer white rice, right? But when we're talking about someone's pronouns, in most instances, it's the other option's not a viable option. Like, have you ever introduced someone and been like, hey, this is Susan. Her pronouns are she, her, hers. But if you're into calling her he, him, his, you can totally do that too. That's fine. Like that's not a thing. Like, right. Like your pronouns are your pronouns. It's not just a preference. And so one of the things that I think have to get away from is using the word preferred, and instead remove that qualifier and just say pronouns, right? Susan's pronouns are she, her, and hers, instead of Susan's preferred pronouns, which gives the impression that if you slip up, it's not a big deal, are she, her, and hers. Because when you slip up, it is a big deal, right? That's called misgendering, and it can be very hurtful. And so let's not act like it's just a matter of preference.
I think that's so crucial. And another analogy I like to use if you're still like not quite getting it is imagine if you were ordering a pizza and the website asked for your preferred address. You know that it's probably going to end up there, but like maybe your neighbor is about to get your sausage pie and like that's really unfortunate. So you would want it to just say address. So it's the same thing as your pronouns. I don't want to feel like you're probably going to use the right words to refer to me. I want to feel like you're going to call me he. So then talking about
analogy.
Yeah, I think it's fun. So, talking about how we can stop assuming what people's pronouns are from looking at them, I think the best thing you can do for companies and for everyone is just normalize saying your pronouns, right? So if you look at Dr. Folks and I, we both have our pronouns in our Zoom picture. I have it in my email signature, on my LinkedIn page. It's just everywhere. I meet someone, I say, hi, I use he, him, his pronouns. What pronouns do you use? So just normalize asking pronouns, because that does two things. One, it makes it so that I know what your pronouns are. Number one, I tell people my pronouns so they know what they are. And number two, if I'm in a space and someone says, I use, he, him, his pronouns, I say, oh, you're someone who has been educated and knows what pronouns are. If you find out I'm trans, you're not going to have a problem with it. I feel safer just knowing that I'm with someone who is showing me they have this little bit of education and are doing this small thing that makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you something quick, because a lot of HR professionals or employers have asked me, is it appropriate to ask or put on an application when you're onboarding a new employee? Is it appropriate to ask their pronouns? Is it appropriate to put it on an application? If you don't, how do you know? So what are your opinions on that?
I think it's absolutely appropriate. I think as long as everyone is being asked, right? And we're not asking based on gender expression or like what we think might be the case. If everyone across the board is being asked, then yeah, not only is it okay, but that actually is probably ideal. Provided you're actually going to utilize that information, and it's not just another checkbox on a form.
That's true. Well, I honestly, we are almost out of time, but I feel like we could talk even longer. There's so much to go over. Before we end this episode, I really would love for you to give me a short, a story of something that's happened that you've seen or maybe experienced yourself at an employer that you felt like the situation was handled poorly. Because I think this will really help to see if that has been handled the same way at other businesses. I know I'm putting you on the spot.
I'll hop in here first
Okay.
while you're thinking, Ben. So this is one that I think happens. I think this happens just because people don't know better. When we are talking about someone who has transitioned, socially, medically, legally, whatever the case, that we need to make sure that we honor the gender that they identify as, and we honor the name that they use now. Right? When we don't do that, when we don't use the appropriate name, it's called dead naming, and it's very hurtful. And when we don't use the appropriate gender, it's called misgendering, and it's very hurtful. Well, one very, very common mistake that I see is that when people are discussing a person and they're sharing a story about them prior to their transition, they revert back to the dead name and they misgender them because that's who they knew them to be at that time. But that's actually really hurtful. And when you're sharing a story about a trans person, even if it occurred prior to their transition, you're still going to utilize their current name and their current gender because that's who they are, right? And in most instances, when you talk to a person, that's who they've always been. They just weren't in a position to be able to speak up and say that at the time. So that's one really, really common mistake. If you knew me as someone else at a different time in my life and you're sharing experiences from back then, still make sure that you're referring to me in my present name and my present gender because that's who I am. So.
That's a great example.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I think for me, and this is something that I referenced earlier, is the idea that as soon as someone comes out, they put on the designated educator hat. So I had this, I haven't been in the working world too long. I just turned 21. But all of the places that I have worked besides my consulting company, I've been the only trans person. And so I've been the, can you explain to us? Can you teach us? In my whole high school, I was one of only 2 trans people. So I was the one training everyone, teaching everyone. And I'm fortunate that I like to educate and I've made that into my job, but for other people that can be exhausting. So I think really just making sure you don't assume when someone comes out, it means that they're like ready to open themselves up for questions. And even if someone is opening themselves up for questions, be selective about what questions you choose to ask in terms of appropriateness. People love to ask, what surgeries have you had? You know, what's in your pants? And like, horrifying. The way that I like to tell people to think about this is if you want to ask a question to a trans person and you're worried it's going to be offensive, Imagine if they asked you that question. So think about how well you know them, where you are. If someone came up to you on the street and said, "Hi, nice to meet you. What kind of underwear are you wearing?" You would be mortified. You would run away. And people think that it's okay to do it for trans people because I say, "Okay, I'm going to tell you one thing about myself and my relationship with my body." And they assume, "Oh, that means you want to talk about everything about your body and your transition is now public domain." So really just making sure that you're asking appropriate questions and only asking questions of a person who wants to give answers. Because there are so many resources online, on Netflix, books, like there are thousands of places to go and learn, or consultants like Dr. Folks and I to hire and pay to support in your learning, rather than just asking for free emotional labor for basic concepts from random trans people that you meet.
Yeah. And understanding, I think that, it's also nuanced, right? That it's really kind of unfair to put the pressure on one person to be able to speak for an entire people group. Like, so yeah, like I totally agree with that, Ben.
Well, I really appreciate both of your time. I think this was very, very helpful, educational, and hopefully it will help make employers' environments a little bit more comfortable for their future and current employees. I know you both are available on LinkedIn. If anyone watching this, any HR professionals or owners, anyone wants to reach out to you, maybe to have you come in or just speak with them further, I know you're both very active, so they can reach out to you directly there. Thanks for coming, you guys.
Thank you so much. It was
Wonderful.
wonderful.